Which one? Because the reality is, we're not used to this. We're used to freezing it so that we can actually get it done and get the reward at the end. The question becomes about this change, and I'm so glad you guys brought up the point of change, because really that's essentially what it is. You keep getting these changes, and how much will you keep accepting these changes? So you have this desired state, and you're going to add some change to it, and you come up with this new end state. Do you take on that change or not? Well, here's the formula. If the cost of the change is lower than or equal to the value of the change, you will always ask for the change. Let me explain that one more time. If the cost of the change is lower than or equal to the value of the change, you will always ask for the change. So again, going back to the writing example for a minute. When we used to write with a paper and pencil, all right, and the pencil happened not to have an eraser, and you wrote something and you looked at it and you saw there's a better way to write it, the cost of that change is pretty high for you. Why? I have to actually throw that away and rewrite all that page at least so that I can rewrite that paragraph. So we think in ourselves, nah, it's not worth it. But with a word processor today, the cost of the change has gone down tremendously that it's a no-brainer. Of course I'll change it. It's a copy and a paste. That's it. With technology today, the cost of the change is going down. That's the trajectory. I mean, think of everything happening around us, and it's all playing on this. The cost of the change is going down. Cell phones, all right? If you look at, I could now change my keyboard, the language on my keyboard with just the touch of a button. Why are new cell phones all screens and no hardware? So that I can change quicker. Ford, all the new cars, the display is an LCD. No odometers or any of that. It's just an LCD. Why? Cost of change is going down. With the rise of software, all the cost of change is coming down. A lot of you guys may work with like big systems, right? It's all about bringing the cost of change down. So guess what? There's more change coming our way. That's a trend that won't change. Now, the physical world this applies to just as well as knowledge work, by the way. The cost of change. Let me tell you a funny story. So I do some work in the Middle East as well, and I was visiting Dubai. And I went to this, they built like a city called University City. I've been there. But one of the princesses there, if you stand in his office, they have like 4 buildings, one after the other, and they all have like domes on the top. So one, in the construction, there was an error, and one of the domes is not aligned. Okay? Now, I just want you to think here for a minute. The cost of the change to align a dome on a built building. But for him, the value of the change was higher. So they actually took out the dome and reconstructed it. But my point is, that's the value of the change for them. Even for us, in the physical world, if you buy a house, you look. What is the cost of the change? What is the cost of taking down this wall, right, and putting a bathroom here or making the living room bigger? And for most of us, we say, no, the cost of the change isn't worth the value, right? We'll just put a nice picture there, or whatever it is. We'll find a workaround. But most of us here deal in the world of knowledge work, where the cost of the change is up here. There's actually very little cost to it. There's time, there may be some effort, but the cost of the change is going down. So this brings a whole different dimension to this notion of an end state. and trying to actually freeze an end state when we know that the global trend is bringing the cost of change down. So with that, we come to, okay, so this sounds a little chaotic now. There's constant change. How do I manage this? Because at the end of the day, we don't want uncontrolled, unstructured anything. We want to have some control over it. So the idea of how do we manage work comes next. And when we talk about that, you sort of have a spectrum here between what's called a defined process and an empirical process. A defined process is a process, if you give it the same inputs, it will give you the same outputs every single time. And an empirical process, given the same inputs, may or may not give you the same outputs every time. So to take a simple example, driving from home to work. Defined or empirical? What do you guys think? Around here. So most of us leave from the same house every morning, right? And we go to the same workplace. True? Defined or empirical? Back to Northern Virginia or any other place, really. Is every day the same commute? May feel that way. But you don't stop at the same traffic light every day the same amount of time, right? Not the same number of cars are in front of you. If you look at the activities and event inside the process, they're unique. They're actually unpredictable every day, depending on the weather, if there's an accident, all that kind of stuff. True? So therefore, actually, it's an empirical process. Even though it looks like same beginning, same end, but the process of managing it is empirical. Why? Because all the events and activities in the middle are changing. So the key here is this. If it's a defined process, then people can first complete the detailed specifications, freeze it, and go build it. Why? Because there's no discovery, low change rates, the uncertainty level is pretty low. But on the other side, when discovery is needed and there's creativity needed and there's high change rates, it's rarely possible to create upfront, unchanging detailed specs. And therefore, over here, it's actually possible to identify, define, and detail all detailed activities up front, because you froze the specs. They did an experiment a few years back in California, the shortest amount of time needed to build a house. Can anyone guess what that is? Those who know, you can say. It's called a 4-hour house. All right? And with the 4-hour house, they built it actually in 3 hours and 20-something minutes. And this is from an empty plot of land to a fully functional house. Look it up. It's on YouTube. It's called a 4-hour house. All right? But here's the interesting part. It took them 8 months to plan the 4 hours. Well, not just that. They rehearsed it a couple of times. Now, in a defined process, you can actually rehearse. Why? Because it's the same thing. But you can't rehearse going from home to work. You can learn, but you can't rehearse. Because the next day is a different day. It's a different set of situations altogether. Does that make sense? So if you look at this, and by the way, this is very assembly line sort of, if you want to think of a defined process, think of an assembly line here. Right? Same inputs, same outputs, day after day. You freeze the requirements, and it's just about building. Here, it's more like cooking. Right? You may have the same ingredients, but every meal comes out in a different way. So if you look at knowledge work, is it right-hand side or left-hand side, folks? Right-hand side? But how do we try to build it? Left-hand side. So it's really like fitting a square peg in a round hole. Would you agree? And here's the challenge. Here's the biggest problem we as an industry have, that we figured out how to fit the square peg in the round hole.